Today I want to talk about why unemployment feels so good to Gen Z, mainly Gen Z, and a little bit of millennials, and doesn't feel good at all to boomers. Okay, and I'm not gonna pick like the extremes. I'm not gonna bash boomers over Gen Z, but I'm just going to talk about it. I'm just going to talk about it just so maybe offer a little bit understanding and maybe gain a little bit understanding in return. So let's get into it. So I want to start off with the boomers and try and understand a little bit about where they're coming from. So the boomer generation, they this is how I understand it. They really do have a solid community with one another, and they also grew up in a solid community with one another, so they really got that foundation. They got and this isn't all boomers, but from how I understand it, generally speaking, boomers did grow up in a normal household. And like the average boomer that you talk to, they'll say like, oh, well, I was dirt poor, we went through like X amount of recessions and like a lot of hardship. Okay, and I completely understand that. But anyways, they've gone through a lot of hardship in a very objective stance. Objectively being like dirt poor. Even though I think I saw a statistic not too long ago that said, in the 1950s, I think it was like around 80 to 90% of spiderweb or spider string. About 80 to 90% of farmland in the 1950s was owned by U.S. citizens. And fast forward to present today, I think it was said in like 2024 about I think it said like less than 1% of farmland was owned by private citizens, and like 99% was owned by like these mega corporations that basically just monopolized it and bought it out. But anyways, so I want to stick with the boomers for a second. So with the older generation, Gen X, boomers, whatever you want to call them, yes, they did grow up with farmland, but like that was typically normal back in their day. That was typically normal to grow up with some farmland. But yeah, they did go through a lot of hardships. They went through multiple recessions. They went through and people were a lot different back then. They were a lot more like physically aggressive. But I think what the boomers had that we don't is a sense of community and a sense of belonging. And like if you start talking to like your grandmother or grandfather, they'll tell you about some harsh hazing events, some harsh events where they were maybe bullied, and you'd be like, man, like that's kind of crazy. I never went through that, so I don't know what all that entails or what all that's about. But at the end of the day, when and now I'm going to kind of get into Gen Z and kind of like try to bridge the gap a little bit. But with them, what they had was that sense of community and that sense of belonging. Because when they went to bed, it was a hard day, but they also can like wake up and they had like their people. They had their people. Where Gen Z is become like this bastard child of the family, kind of like this redheaded stepchild, if you will. Where Gen Z is just like they generally don't go through like those kind of hardships early on in life. A lot of the hardships that we see in like the boomer generation is kind of being seen like later down the line, when like now that we're graduating. And I know like the older generations will say like, well, Gen Z just kind of has like this hard time of growing up. Gen Z has this hard time of really just accepting the world for what it is and just going out there. And absolutely valid. But I feel like there is a missing piece. I feel like there is a missing piece and a little bit of lack of understanding as well. And like the majority of Gen Z, we generally did grow up with the technology, so we were really kind of like the lab rat of, you know, that economy, you know, unrestricted, completely unrestricted access to the internet. And, you know, yeah, you could say, well, you know, you didn't have to spend time on the internet. That's understandable, but also that's easy to say. That's easy to shoot shots from like over the line over there. But, you know, you just got to understand, like, you know, that's what everyone at that age was doing. So it was kind of like you would kind of ostracize yourself. You would kind of alienate yourself if you weren't divulging in, you know, the internet. If you weren't divulging in video games, which, you know, like growing up, you know, my mom would always say, like, oh, it's got to be that damn phone, or you know, like, you got to get off video games, this, that, and the other. And like, she's absolutely right. She's absolutely right, you know. But eventually, like, it kind of got to a point where, like, video games, social media, the internet got more accepting, when I don't think it should have been. I don't think it should have been accepting, because I believe it is very valuable as a tool, and that's it. I think it's valuable as a tool. Other than that, I think it's very, very harmful to, like, almost every social aspect of this society. And, you know, that's very reflective, and that's very prevalent when you look at the Gen Z generation. You know, like, anytime you go on social media, a lot of it's fear mongering, a lot of it's like doomer content. I said doomer with a D, not with a B. Where, you know, it's kind of like hopelessness. It's like, oh shoot, it's kind of like hopeless content that that kind of gives you this drive to just not do anything. This drive just to stand still. It doesn't give you a drive to do anything passionate. Now I want to get into the community aspect of what the boomers had that Gen Z just doesn't really seem to have. So I want to get into that. So the boomers, and just like I said, I just want to reiterate for just a second, where the spiderweb, the boomers had a lot of hardships, but they also had a sense of community. So whenever they faced hardships, they can, you know, they can really reach out to someone. They can really talk to someone, and like, I can already hear the replies where they say, well, you know, back then we didn't talk about our feelings, this, that, and the other, which I don't believe is entirely true. You know, and I think, yes, the feelings were kind of handled differently. But at the end of the day, like, even if you didn't have, you know, even if you had a hard time expressing your feelings to other people, you know, you generally had people at least to be around. So now I want to get into the Generation Z side of this, okay? So with Generation Z, generally speaking, like, there's not a whole lot of bullying going on. Believe me, there is bullying. I have been in school fights myself, and I have you know, been bullied a little bit, but not to the extent where, like, you hear the average boomer say, like, oh, like, you know, I used to walk, you know, up the side of, you know, a viaduct bridge, like 12 miles a day, and there was like these kids that, you know, you had to avoid, or else, you know, they meant trouble. Absolutely, I 100% hear you there. However, though Gen Z doesn't experience that, not to the severity, they do have a lack of community with everyone, you know. And I do think a lot of that has been growing up on social media, has been growing up on technology, you know. Whereas the average Gen Zer, you know, they go home and they don't exactly do anything, you know. And I heard someone in, like, the last YouTube video, they said, like, man, there's like an overall lack of, like, emotional connection from the Gen Zs to compared to the boomers, where, like, the Gen Z, they think they're getting, like, all these connections, all these communities through online, and it's all fake, it's all false. And, you know, that individual, I think her name was, I forget, but she was getting a little bit heated. But I do agree with that point. I do agree where, you know, growing up, especially me, you know, I would get on, like, Xbox Live, I would get on various, like, internet websites, and I would start chit-chatting with people, you know, and thinking, like, that's how I'm getting my sense of community, that's how I'm getting my sense of, like, camaraderie, friendship, whatever. When in reality, it's all fake, it's all fabricated, you know. Because at the end of the day, like, yeah, those are people at maybe like the other end of the world that you're talking to, but you aren't seeing them in person. You know, you aren't, more often than not, you're not really making goals with them. You know, which is why I believe Gen Z does have struggles. I don't know if the boomer generation would exactly be willing to admit, but I'm just asking that you kind of find a little bit of understanding so we can maybe even like bridge the gap between one another. You know, we see this in like the statistics that are coming out, where they say like, you know, 1/4 Gen Z isn't engaging in like sexual intercourse, isn't engaging. I thought I saw a statistic not too long ago where it said like it was a large percentage. I think it was like 70-80% of Gen Z aren't going to bars anymore. They aren't going out drinking. You know, and I think a lot of that is just how everyone grew up. You know, like, I don't know about a lot of you, but for me, you know, like, I was kind of grew up like, man, like my parents, you know, like the boomer generation, they raised us so harshly, you know, and there was such like a lack of connection with them that we're gonna really just kind of be happy with you, and you don't have to do that. You know, you don't have to you know, go to football practice. Hey, you don't have to go to baseball practice. Hey, you can drop track if you want to. Hey, you can you know, just be okay with getting C's in high school. Hey, you don't have to go to dances. And while, yeah, I kind of do understand that, because, you know, I've also seen people that say like, I got out of baseball because my dad was being like a huge dick to me. I got out of wrestling because my dad ruined it for me. It was just pushing when I didn't think I needed to be pushed that hard, and kind of ruined that aspect of that sport for me. You know, but there also is something to be said about being the parents of your generation, you know? And I think a lot of Gen Zers can relate to what I'm about to say, where it's like I was more of like a friend to my mom and my dad growing up, rather than being like a kid, rather than being a son, you know, because like a lot of Gen Z parents, and I can attest this and I can relate to this, were going out to the bar scene, where, you know, especially like a lot of people in my generation grew up in single parent households, which, you know, I don't think a lot of boomers could attest to, where the Gen Z generation, yeah, like they didn't have the strictness of their parents, you know, breathing down their neck, and, you know, really getting the pressure to perform and do well, or else, you know, they're going to get the belt or get the backhand or the wooden spoon or like whatever, you know, throwing hand. I don't exactly know verbatim, but, you know, I think there's also something to be said about a lack of that, a lack of discipline, you know, and in the Bible even says this, like, do not spare the child the rod, or something like that, you know. So I think there's something to be said about that, where, you know, now, yeah, like now we're seeing our generation kind of get into adulthood. I heard someone say a while ago, like, generational trauma, so I'm just going to use that word. You know, where we're seeing a lot of generational trauma being passed down, where, you know, the boomers were, you know, maybe a little too harsh on the millennial generation. The millennial generation were, you know, not as much of a parent as maybe they should have been. And I'm not throwing shade at any particular generation whatsoever. But what I am doing is I'm just trying to point out stuff that I think would help for everyone to understand one another, rather than just, you know, sitting and, you know, kind of developing this, like, I want to say, like, pettiness and this bitterness towards one another. Because at the end of the day, the past is the past. You know, that's something I recognized. And I think it is good to, you know, try to find understanding for each generation and each generational gap, so then we can learn to, you know, just find a middle ground and get over that hump, so we can really get more of a belonging back together that the boomer generation had. That I think if we can really get a sense of belonging with one another, I think that'll be huge. I think that'll be be massive. And I think that can really be the sort of turning point, if you will, to be and to go on to the right track. You know, in the Gen Z generation, going back to like the community aspects, I think that is so important. I'm just gonna keep harping on it. The community aspect, where yeah, Gen Z generally does have more opportunities to make something of themselves, but man, I don't think Gen Z has a lot of opportunities to learn just to get by. You know, that's something I've been struggling with. You know, like, especially, and the community aspect does play a role in here, where like I'm a single man, and you know, the rent prices, or like the role that the community plays is like, yeah, the rent price is super expensive, but a lot of these struggles can be fixed if we were to come together. You know, if I were to be able to communicate, you know, better with my generation, if my generation can communicate better with one another, you know, vice versa, then, you know, maybe I can get some people to split the rent with me, some people to split the bills, the expenses, you know, and maybe even a lady, you know, maybe I can get a lady to split the bills, expenses, and whatever, and then we can eventually start up a family, and so on and so forth. You know, I don't think it's so much it's the younger generation versus the older generation. It's not man versus woman. It's not Democrats versus Republicans. I think it really is us versus the people in higher power. And I know people will say like, oh, like now we're like, here comes this conspiracy theorist. I don't even think it's a conspiracy theory. I think it really is. You know, I think it's really the truth. You know, how is all this doomer content, doomer with a D, being pushed onto everyone? But then when I go outside, dude, it's all nice. You know, I talk to the boomers, and yeah, I have had, believe me, I have had experiences where I'm like, man, that guy was super rude, or that grandma didn't even say hi, or, you know, like whatever. But, you know, I go out and I do the same thing with Gen Z. I try to say hi to them. They're always plugged into their earbuds, their headphones, or they're looking down at their phone. You know, there's a overall lack of eye contact, which I heard someone say a while back, and I completely agree with that. But yeah, there's an overall lack of socialness to the Gen Z generation, and I think a lot of that has to do with you know, social media. I think a lot of that has to do with social media, that, you know, is maybe something that can bridge the gap with the older generations. You know, maybe that's something that I can agree with, and that we can learn to, you know, kind of take that and just go off from there. Spiderweb. You know, whereas now you see a lot of Gen Zers who are at like record numbers of unemployment. And yeah, like a lot of people can blame the economy. A lot of people can blame the boomers. They can blame their parents, the millennials. Really, I think it's a lack of community. You know, because like you look at the millennials, a lot of millennials, or a small amount of millennials, are unemployed and aren't really working, but the majority of them are. You know, I think a vast majority of boomers are working, even you know, even throughout their retirements. Whereas Gen Zers, you know, they might have a solid job picked out. You know, I've heard of so many people, they get like these corporate jobs, or maybe they get in like to the trades, or they get into maybe like law enforcement, serving their community, whatever. But they still just aren't content. They still aren't satisfied. You know, I think that is a lack of community. You know, whether or not anyone wants to admit it, I think it's the truth. I think it is the truth. And yes, you can say, well, Gen Zers, they just need to like get their act together. But I think really, I think what would be more helpful to the average Zoomer individual, if you will, welcome them into a community. You know, you can start going to maybe church every Sunday, and then, you know, you can start going to like Bible study classes. Maybe you can, you know, join a guitar club or running club, or like whatever. Because I think that is the number one issue between bridging the gap between generations, is the community. And I think that's why you see a lot of Gen Zers, you know, there's like this huge surge of Gen Zers going to church. I saw that statistic a little while ago. I forget what percentage of Zoomers have started going to church, but I know it's a lot. I know it's more than, I think, the past millennials and boomers in their generation. I think there is a huge revival going on with Zoomers. And I think that's a community that is welcoming. You know, you see a lot of, like myself included, I started going to church not too long ago. And I'm like, man, this is really nice. You know, because if I were to go to a gym with mainly millennials and boomers, I wouldn't be as welcomed. And I have had issues with that where, you know, they kind of form like these little cliques, like straight out of high school. And I don't know what it is. They just don't exactly like me. They don't exactly like who I am. I don't know. I don't know. I couldn't tell you. You know, but when I go to a church, there's no pressure to perform. There's no pressure to be someone that you don't want to be. There's no pressure to be anything that you don't believe in, above all. And overall, there's a sense of belonging because it's, you know, it's not just chasing your personal desires. You know, when you go out to the gym, yeah, that's cool, but you're still isolated. You know, you're still chasing your own goals, your personal goals. Whereas if you go to a church, you know, maybe you go to like MMA classes or some sort of martial art class, which is cool, but it's still like your own goals. You know, you aren't really focusing on something bigger than yourself, which I think the church brings. The church brings a sense of belonging and a passion for something that's just bigger than you, something that's bigger than yourself. And you know, I have been to churches where you typically do dress like very formal, but you know, I'll tell you what, God's not trying to, got a little roundabout here. You know, God's not trying to ask anything from you. You know, he's trying to ask everything of you. You know, he's trying to meet you exactly with where you're at, which, you know, a lot of these boomer-led churches, you know, I just typically haven't seen that. You know, I have been to a boomer-led church where it was actually a female pastor, believe it or not. And I was just getting into the faith, and I didn't really know that that's unbiblical. I was like, okay, well, girl power, I guess, you know. And then I tried asking her questions, and she didn't really, you know, like have the answers to my questions. And you know, I try to talk with the boomers, and you know, they're polite. You know, they said hi, hello, how's it going? But you know, there wasn't really a sense of belonging. It wasn't really a sense of community. You know, so I don't think it works to have just one generation kind of ostracize themselves. Whether it's the boomers being content with where they're at, where they say, I'm not passing down any wealth to the previous generations, because I think they're just a bunch of brats, or maybe I just don't like where their headspace is at. I feel like they'll squander my wealth, you know. And I think that's where the community has to come in with one another. You can't just keep everything for yourself. You know, at the end of the day, everything here is worldly, everything passes away. And like same thing with the millennials, you know, they ostracize themselves in their own ways. And you know, it might not be, hey, I'm not passing down any wealth to you or any knowledge, but I'm just going to kind of follow my desires. You know, I'm just going to go do the bar scene, and I don't care what you think, which I have had experience with, you know, one of my parents as well, where, you know, they just go bar hopping. They kind of engage in like hookup culture, and they just kind of do whatever they want. They leave the kids at home to their own devices to later become vices that are very hard to, you know, let go. And now with the Gen Z generation, they ostracize themselves by saying like, man, I just need to keep my peace. You know, everything has to be about me. You know, as long, like, even though I don't have a sense of community, well, at least I have like this body that I've attained. You know, at least I have, you know, myself, and I. You know, at least I have this video games. You know, that's a lot of my generation is just chasing themselves. You know, more than any other generation, Gen Z has been the biggest chaser of themselves. And believe me, I used to be on that path as well. You sow seeds of selfishness and you reap loneliness. You reap, you reap what you sow. Basically, what I'm trying to say. So every generation has kind of ostracized themselves in some way. And man, I'm not saying like you gotta put up with the other generation's BS, whatever it may be. But I do think that, we have to try and like bridge that gap. Whatever it may be, whatever content that you might be ingesting right now, CNN, Fox, the Daily Wire, whatever, the left side is on like independentness, and for like the Gen Z generation, a lot of doomer content from like Nick Fuentes, from Candace Owens, from and then like a lot of other independent YouTubers. You're gonna do like a lot of doomer content. Whatever it is that you're ingesting, I ask that you might be able to set that aside and just try and reach out to them, the other generation, and then not only the other generation, but try and reach out to your own generation, the generation that you don't exactly like too much, and say like, hey, I understand where you're coming from, but just hear me out and hear it from my perspective, and then, if push comes to shove and you both still don't agree and you guys can't agree, you can just say, hey, let's agree to disagree, and let's just meet up tomorrow so we can keep chit-chatting and keep throwing balls of knowledge towards one another, so we can keep, this sense of community alive. So, that's my thoughts on why Gen Z, I believe, enjoys being unemployed so much. And I've been unemployed for a little while. I've been in other spurts where I was unemployed. And it's hard, because when you're when you're in that phase of working nonstop, saving up money, but you don't have anyone at your side. You don't have a sense of community. It's like, yeah, this is hard, but at least I have my church community to come to go to. At least I have my friends and family to go to. You don't really have that with the Gen Zer. So I ask, try to gain a little bit of understanding from one another. And I think that's it. I think that's all I got to say. All right, bye. God bless.